Well, thank you, Alan, for that very generous introduction. I do appreciate that. Now, as you all know, we're gathered here this afternoon, as we have in the morning, to honour the achievements of Ian Callinan, a leading figure in the Australian legal profession, and as a voice for reason and civility in related areas of communal engagement. These include literature and venues for discussion, such as the Samuel Griffith Society. Ian Callinan has been a keen observer of the Australian scene in various ways. In a paper to a judicial conference given shortly before completing his term on the High Court, he considered the validity of Edmund Burke's contention that practice of the law sharpens the mind by narrowing it. Callinan acknowledged that sharpness of mind is an essential attribute of a successful advocate in an adversary system, but went on to say that interests separately from the law are a means of improving judicial work. With this in mind, let me say that I greatly admire Ian Callinan's role as the author of 12 skillfully crafted novels, plus 6 professionally produced plays and many thoughtful essays. And like Alan, I noticed that piece in the Spectator, which reflects on this, because Ian's review of the film in question opens with a line that is characteristic of his wit and good humour. Let me quote, "I thought it would be impossible to make a bad film about a dog, but the production team for The Friend has managed to pull it off." So I think Ian's work in all sorts of respects, and perhaps even in that quotation, shows that a long career in the law does not necessarily narrow the mind. Other judges have turned to literature, including the first Chief Justice of the High Court, Sir Samuel Griffith, after whom the Society is named. But Griffith's translations of Dante's Inferno and Divine Comedy fall far short of Callinan's path through the literary world, an Inferno, and often a comedy of a different but equally inflammatory kind. Time weighs against me, so I will speak only of his novels, all of which are of the highest order and point to the way in which there is an overlap between law and literature, and I will come to that. In a legal system reflecting democratic values, opposing arguments in court lead to a deeper understanding of different viewpoints. The same can be said of certain works of fiction, especially novels enriched by unusual ideas. They encourage readers to see things from a viewpoint other than their own. Unlike so many responses to current issues raised in Parliament or in TV interviews, where what is said on each side is all too familiar, novels can highlight new ways of thinking about matters of concern, from domestic relations to the use or misuse of power in other settings, including political settings. Perhaps this is what Callinan had in mind in suggesting that interests beyond the bench can be a means of improving legal and judicial work. Ian Callinan's first novel, The Lawyer and the Libertine, was published in 1997, shortly before he was appointed to the High Court. It traces the fortunes of two boys born in Sydney in the 1920s, George Dice and Stephen Mentmore. Their paths soon diverge. A sporting hero, the ebullient George Dice, leaves school to become a political staffer and an enthusiastic womaniser. Towards the end of World War II, he accompanies the Labour Minister for External Affairs, Dr. Narotti, to the San Francisco conference where the United Nations is being formed. Some years later, Dr. Narotti's long-standing opponent, a Conservative Prime Minister, manages to embarrass George Dice's boss by announcing a royal commission into Soviet espionage following the defection of a Russian intelligence officer stationed in Canberra. In the meantime, Stephen Mentmore has picked up a law degree and is on his way to the top as a barrister. He is briefed to cross-examine members of Dr. Narotti's staff and manages to dispose of George Dice, his womanising rival, with surgical precision. After this, many people believe that Dice's political career is over. But no, as the years go by, it isn't long before he reappears as a Labor Attorney-General in an era resembling the Whitlam years. Surrounded by a throng of salivating journalists, he leads a controversial raid on the ASIO office. The austere Stephen Mentmore, having become Chief Justice of the High Court, is eventually obliged to surrender his place at the helm to a new Chief Justice whose conveniently progressive views suit the government. It turns out, however, while the Attorney-General, George Dice, is savouring the departure of his rival, that a bundle of Kemlani-like documents linking Dice to some dubious Swiss bank accounts have been delivered to a prominent media boss. In the usual way, I will leave it to readers to find out for themselves what happens in the end. But it emerges from what I've said briefly so far that Callinan is well versed in the ways of politics and the legal world. His novel obliges us to dwell upon the vagaries of political careers and the ideals, dilemmas, compromises and betrayals facing ambitious players in the public arena. Discerning readers, and certainly anyone who has been attending leftish literary festivals in recent years, will gather from this outline of the plot why the literary gatekeepers in this country have been slow to appreciate and acclaim Callinan's work. As it is with the best writers, he doesn't march to mantras approved by others. He steps to the sound of a different drummer, the music that he himself hears. Now, let me add this. Multi-layered novels, garnished by ideas and related insights, are comparatively rare in Australian literature. This brings me to the second matter I mentioned at the outset, that is the overlap between law and literature, and the way in which Callinan's novels bear upon the use of language and the work of practising lawyers. Mark Twain once said that most writing by lawyers, especially judges, could be described as chloroform in print. A witty remark, but rather harsh. A judge, in summing up a case, unlike a storyteller such as Charles Dickens or Mark Twain himself, is required by judicial practice to avoid conjecture and stick to a narrow path, a response based on admissible evidence, the exclusion of certain matters that may be overly prejudicial, legal reasoning delivered in a calm and impartial tone. These considerations are vital, but inevitably they weigh against the telling of a colourful tale. The judge in the recent mushroom murder case, for example, was obliged to give very careful directions to the jury as to certain lies told by the accused. To lie was bad, but it didn't necessarily establish that she was guilty of murder. The situation before the court included enigmatic characters and events, all the elements of a gripping drama, but it wasn't open to the judge to say so in a colourful way. Reasons for judgment or directions to a jury are there to show how the final ruling came about and to enable a higher court to review the reasoning if the matter is taken on appeal. One has to keep in mind, however, that laws change and the way in which the facts of a matter are selected and construed may also be affected by changing social attitudes and forms of reasoning. The French avant-garde film director Jean-Luc Godard, for example, declared that yes, stories should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. This set the scene for much of the similar tangled talk adrift in the postmodern era. The rule of law in Western democracies is a means of protecting everyone from arbitrary action and securing fair and equal treatment for all. In recent years, however, academic lawyers, mesmerised by what is called critical legal theory, began to argue that the rule of law is, and always has been, simply an instrument of oppression, designed to entrench the power of the post-colonial ruling class. Progressive literati cast off common sense and reading books and turned to deconstructing texts. Debate in contemporary times can finish up as a mass of verbiage swelled by input from activists and public relations gurus. Confected outrage, affectations of deep concern, half-truths, shallow rhetoric, these are ever present. Leaders of the yes case in the Voice referendum were inclined to call any argument against them misinformation. The fashionable word truth-telling can be a cosmetic used by activists not just to reconfigure but to embellish the truth. As we've just heard, even experts dither as the meaning of well-known words such as woman or woke or inclusion, all too often used to justify exclusion. Is our grip on reality gradually disappearing into an Orwellian wilderness of smoke and mirrors, a realm in which meaning is constantly masked by ambiguity and political agendas? Many readers, however, still yearn for stories couched in a familiar form, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, written with insight and a clear understanding of the way things are in life for a cast of believable characters. We must remind ourselves also that the images used by political cartoonists and other satirical works can play a potent role in decoding contentious rhetoric. They can be used not only to debunk, but to stimulate further thought about current issues, including the workings of the legal system in uncertain times. I will turn to one of Ian Callinan's most powerful novels, called Dislocation, to explore these points. The story opens in 1946, at a time when the war hero General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers administering the defeated Japanese Empire, is carrying into effect his grand strategy for converting Japan to a democracy. As at Nuremberg in Europe, he has set up in Tokyo a war crimes tribunal. The case against the Japanese defendants in the novel includes a certain Admiral Hashika, and this case will be presented to a panel of judges drawn from America's wartime allies, headed by Sir Michael Bailey, the Chief Justice of Queensland. A youthful academic lawyer, Bill Liston, has been recruited to the Australian prosecuting team preparing a case against the Japanese admiral. Liston has a background in international law, but has been brought in principally because he had played a supportive role when Chief Justice Bailey was investigating war crimes in New Guinea. It soon becomes clear to Liston, the young lawyer, that Chief Justice Bailey, with a history-making role in the proceedings, is keen to see justice done, and in a way that will lead to all those responsible for atrocities, even at the highest level, being convicted, then executed. Like others around him, Bailey is aware that in attempting to create a democracy acceptable to the Japanese people, General MacArthur, the American Caesar, as some biographers have called him, is loath to overthrow the revered Japanese emperor. Hence, for political reasons, it seems likely that the apportioning of criminal responsibility will be subject to certain ill-defined limitations. Liston, the young lawyer, becomes increasingly troubled by the various conflicts of interest and other procedural flaws facing those involved in the forthcoming trial. Although most of the lawyers around him seem to be turning a blind eye to concerns of this kind. Quote, the criminal law expert, a staffer says to Liston upon being introduced to him. Reasonable doubt and all that sort of thing. I don't know whether we're going to have much use for that around here. I assist the judge and report to the government. He shook hands with Bill Liston. Liston is well aware that common law traditions and the rule of law require that judges be impartial and act not upon personal knowledge or earlier investigations, but only upon admissible evidence presented to the court. Prosecutors are expected to act fairly in framing supportable charges, the details of which are to be conveyed to the defendants and their advisers in a timely way. Neither the judge nor the prosecutor are to be viewed as servants of the government or as parties serving the same cause. Bill Liston, conscious that both he and Chief Justice Bailey, having previously been involved in investigating atrocities, feels that neither of them should be involved in this trial. For various reasons, they could be accused of apprehended bias. An objection by defence counsel based on US constitutional law concerning due process is brushed aside also, although MacArthur is, in effect, both the prosecutor and appointer of the court. The prevailing mindset seems to be, give the defendants a fair trial, then hang them. It seems that a view to the contrary could damage Liston's career and the careers of many of those around him. Tension mounts as the first day of the hearing approaches. Bill Liston's realisation that he shares defence counsel's doubts about the trial leads to an encounter with the defendant, Admiral Hashika, brought about by Liston's increasing sympathy for the female interpreter who was brought in during the process of pre-trial preparation. The Admiral Liston is led to believe may have information bearing upon the Emperor's state of knowledge, as to how hostilities in the Pacific arena were to be conducted. This could lead to a plea bargain, but more likely, if the information is brought to light, it will lead to the Chief Justice seeking to impeach the Emperor, while as MacArthur, on the other hand, will almost certainly take steps to suppress the information, a difference of opinion that could derail the historic trial and the aspirations of those involved. At the opening of the trial, aware that by sharing some of his concerns with the defence team he has compromised himself, Liston has to face up to the events that follow, including the resolution of his personal dilemma, his ties to a girlfriend in Australia, and his affection for the gently spoken interpreter who has become so important to him in seeking to understand what the devastation of war has meant to she and her family. The central character, Liston, is presented in a convincing way. He's not exactly an idealist, but unlike most of those around him, lawyers accustomed to plea bargaining, compromises and pragmatism, the youthful Liston is inclined to give greater weight to basic principles. He isn't presented by the author as a white knight clad in altruistic armour. He is pictured essentially as a young professional in a ruined world, trying to find his way through a tangled mass of competing considerations, legal and political, the upending of normality as it was in Nuremberg. In the end, Liston is deeply angered by the attitude of his colleagues to values underlying the rule of law. The author provides a convincing representation of a man brought finally to a crucial understanding of the situation before him, a feeling of being stranded in a new era dominated by ignorance and self-interest, a representation of things to come perhaps, a realisation that the rule of law can be undermined not only by dramatic insurrections in the streets, but also by pervasive indifference and choices made in high haste behind closed doors. In bringing significant issues into play, Ian Callinan, unlike so many of his contemporaries on the local literary scene, is also adept at portraying with sensitivity and considerable insight unsettled states of mind in dire times, from the anxieties of a professional advisor confronted by troubling dilemmas to the tenderness of a loving couple seeking to understand the nature and future of their relationship. His novel Dislocation portrays a unique moment in world history that took place close to 80 years ago. Nonetheless, it speaks also to current concerns and to the future, because we now seem to be entering an era in which, on a global scale, normality is being upended and former values are being constantly challenged by politicians and commentators using ambiguous language, and often by political staffers and activists on university campuses. The line between constructive thought and biased reasoning is often blurred, as is the ghostly line between argument and misinformation, truth-telling and truth, orthodoxies and frank opinions. Works of fiction can act as a catalyst for thought about matters of importance. Callinan's latest novel, A Prefect of the Press, brought out recently by his usual publisher, Australian Scholarly Publishing, underlines this point by tracing the career of an ambitious journalist over several decades, leaving casualties behind him, including truth. I am privileged to have had this opportunity to say something about the skills of a fine lawyer and an outstanding novelist, Ian Callinan, whose works cast light on what is going on in our society, on what should be avoided, and on what should be cherished. Books are not just texts, they are a vital part of the world they portray.